Good morning. Welcome to Impact Fee Reductions as Incentives, Whether They Work session. I'm Neil Günkemp with Tyndall Oliver. We also have Dave Goldstein with Pasco County who will be presenting. I have helpers in the audience who's going to help us with all the tough questions. I'm going to start giving a little bit of an overview, and then we were supposed to also have Nancy Attino from the City of Orlando, but she couldn't make it. So we'll cover her section, but she also said if anybody has any questions later, she'll be happy to talk to anyone. So feel free to contact her. So before we get into the detailed case studies, we just wanted to give you a more broader perspective. So of course you know why we are here and why we do impact fees, but just to start thinking from that perspective, we implement impact fees because we have growth happening and we have infrastructure that needs to be funded. So we have a need for this dollar amount. And of course it has good qualifications like the equity, and also it's a sort of a self-correcting revenue. If there's no growth, we don't have it. So when we get into giving impact fee discounts as incentives, we need to still keep in mind that we have a revenue need. So those incentives need to be more targeted, selective, as opposed to across the board to be useful. At least those are the type of incentives we are talking about in this session. So two primary goals are economic development type goals and community goals. So it could be the increasing revenue per acre, per unit of development, and improving our stability of revenues could be some of the goals why we are giving impact fee discounts. Community goals may be more efficient development patterns, so kind of bringing the development where infrastructure is already there, providing housing that's affordable, mobility, transportation, all these could be some of the goals. Then we get into how do we measure if these are actually being useful. So when we look at the economic development goals, things that are indicators that are telling us whether we are succeeding or not are like increases in wages and income, employment to population ratios, increased revenue per acre, those kind of things, stability of revenues between residential and non-residential, and then some of the outcomes, again, reduce cost and increase revenues. So this chart is showing you two counties going all the way back to mid-70s. They're ranking in terms of wages per job. So here, St. Johns County, this is two Florida counties, and we have 67 counties in Florida. So St. Johns County used to rank 44th in mid-70s in terms of wages per job out of the 67 counties. And over time, they improved their ranking to 18, so they show a significant improvement. That's one of the ways we can measure if our programs are working. Another county going the other direction is the Union County losing ground. Similarly here, employment per capita, same type of thing. You see Walton County improving over time, Gulf County getting worse. This chart shows the tax-based distribution of Osceola County. So this is the distribution in terms of residential, non-residential. So the more diverse we are during the economic downturn, so we are handling those type of situations better. And here, they used to be about almost like 65% residential, 35% non, and it got worse. Right now, they are about 80% residential. So they are losing ground in terms of their diversity of tax base. And this is Hernando County, about pretty stable, slightly improving. It's another one. Another type of consideration, and we're going to get into that a little bit more when we do the Orlando case study, is the type of development that we give incentive to. So in Orlando, these circles, A1, A2, A3, they are their activity centers, and they are connected by mixed-use corridors, those, the rectangular C1, C2. So those make up about 3% of their land mass, but generate about almost 50% of revenue. So those are the type of development you probably want to encourage, give incentive to. And impact fees is one of them. Again, in terms of measurement, community goals, it could be the mix and density of development. Home ownership, availability of more affordable workforce housing could be one of the measurements. Improve mobility in terms of reduced trips, increase internal capture, and non-auto trips. Those all could be some of the measurements. Then when we figure out our goals and how we're going to go about measuring them, the other item is the targets. Like, who do we target based on these goals? So it could be, for economic development goals, it could be the specific industries, certain wage levels, like giving discounts to certain type of wages. Again, those who are providing housing. Community goals could be infill redevelopment, so where the infrastructure is already there. Mixed-use development, again, for the same type of reason, they tend to be more efficient and also create more tax revenues. There are other reasons where we provide discounts. There could be the characteristics of the development require that. It's more of a technical calculation. If it's a mixed use, true mixed use, it may be generating fewer trips, say for transportation. It's a more efficient use so that they do need to be charged a lesser amount. Same type of thing, retail restaurant in a downtown core where there's not much parking, then usually people just come to the office and then walk to the retail restaurant. Those entities don't necessarily generate additional trips. It could be no fee zones. And so all these are different than across the board reductions that we see, which are more political in nature. So there are several communities providing incentives, and we're going to talk about Pasco and Orlando out of those. When we are providing incentives, there's a concern that when you pick and choose who you give discounts, are you hurting equity among land users? Is there any legal issues? And some of the things we look at, whether it's de minimis in terms of its revenue loss. So if it's a rare type of development and that's why you are trying to attract them, that's why you're giving these in the first place, it may be happening so infrequently that the revenue loss is pretty minimal. There could be differential level of service. I think Pasco has examples of that. And then, of course, you can always buy down the differential with tax revenues to make the impact fee pot whole again. And again, some of the legal considerations is having the comprehensive plan and statutory support, as well as dual rational nexus that Dave will get into it more during his presentation. This is one thing I want to kind of show why we think across the board reductions are not necessarily as effective. So this is, again, Florida map with the blue and yellow counties are those that have a transportation impact fee. And the dark counties never implemented an impact fee. So when you look at their growth rate between 1980 and 2007, you can see that those who implemented were growing almost twice the rate that the ones didn't. So that makes intuitive sense. If you have growth, you're going to need the money and you're going to implement the impact fees. Then a subset of those got into the moratorium during the downturn, and sort of we tried to track if that helped. And during that time, between 07 and 16, we really didn't see a big benefit to those counties. Their growth rate was still lower than those who kept their impact fee. And the numbers are pretty close, so it's hard to draw exact conclusions. But overall, this across-the-board reductions tend to be more political type decisions. And there's so many other market factors in having a product that it really don't seem to sway one way or another the development. So the general results, before we get into the case studies, is that one good thing about these discounts, it signals the local government support to certain type of development. It does not seem to have much impact without other incentives. And finally, we found they tend to be most effective with development at margin. So it's the small starter homes or small businesses. That's kind of the type of development we are overall seeing some impact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
Good morning. See if I can get this right. Okay. To a certain extent, Pasco is a good case study to use because we have a number of different types of incentives. We have basically the whole kitchen sink of incentives. We have geographic incentives, we have use incentives, we have form incentives. So really any type of incentive you want to possibly do, we have it in Pasco. Let me explain how we got there. first, let me talk about geographic incentives. So geographic incentives, we wanted, in Pasco County, we generally wanted to encourage growth in our urban service area, and I'm going to show you a map of where that is. And the way we did that in terms of geographic incentives is we created a tiered mobility fee system where we generally have lower fees in our urban service area, or urban market area, and then progressively higher fees in our rural and suburban market areas. Again, we're trying to encourage growth, discourage urban sprawl. So it's a land use goal that we're trying to achieve. We did that a few ways. The number one way we did that is we have different levels of service in our urban area versus we intentionally allowed more congestion in our urban area. The theory being that we're going to encourage more transit ridership in the urban area. And we allowed less congestion or a higher level of service in our suburban and rural areas. We also looked at the differential and trip lengths. So the trip lengths are obviously shorter in your urban area. You drive farther in the rural area to get to the grocery store than you do in the urban area. So we looked at the differential and trip lengths as well. So between trip length differential and level of service differential, we were able to create various tiers. And so what we did is we have generally 5 market areas in Pasco County. And for those of you that don't know where Pasco County is, it's kind of the northern part of the Tampa Bay area. To our south is Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg. So the west part of the county is kind of existing development, a lot of older housing stock, older commercial stock. Our highest growth area tends to be our southern area of the county because it borders the Tampa Bay urban service area. And then we have our more suburban area, which we combined our central and east market areas to be our suburban area, and then our northern areas we consider to be our rural area. So when I talk about the urban area or the urban service area in Pasco, it's generally this combined area of the west and the south, and then our suburban area is all of this orangish red color, the central and east, and then the north would be the rural area. And this takes those same areas and then puts them, we converted these into different, what we call mobility fee assessment districts. So the west and south market area became our urban assessment district, central and east became suburban, and C, the rural. So that's our geographic tiering, or geographic incentives. We also have, in terms of use incentives, we have preferred rates for particular uses where we're trying to encourage either economic development or tourism. So, and I'm going to get into later into what these rates are, but in terms of use incentives, we have preferred rates for office, industrial, those are generally considered to be economic development uses, and then lodging or hotel, which is generally considered to be a use that encourages tourism. And then what we call form-based incentives. Form-based incentives, we have reduced fees for traditional neighborhood development, transit-oriented development, and then a new category, and I'll have to explain to you why we call this, but it's called a MUDRM project, or mixed-use trip reduction measure project. This is sort of a made-up term, but the reason we had to create it is because for whatever reason in Pasco County, T&D is a bad word. So what we had to do is create a category of, it accomplishes a lot of the same goals as T&D in the sense that it has to be mixed use, it has to have a minimum density, it has to have a complete bicycle pedestrian network, it has to have good intersection density or public grid. So it has a lot of the characteristics of T&D, but maybe not necessarily all the alleys and front porches that T&D would have. So I call it T&D light, but the technical term is MUDRM, and so we have a reduced fee for that. And then we also have incentives for the redevelopment of our west market area. I'm going to cover that in more detail in a second. So again, use-based incentives, form-based incentives, and then we have the geographic incentives that I talked about earlier. So how do we do this? Because you've got all these different incentives all over the place. How do we do that in reality and make it legal? The primary way we do it, besides the differential levels of service and trip lengths, is we use other transportation revenues to buy down or subsidize these favored uses or forms or geographic locations. So in Pasco, we adopted a second local option gas tax, which is not all counties in Florida have that, but we adopted that. So we sort of maxed out our gas tax. We also have a portion of our sales tax, which we call penny for Pasco, that it's used for transportation. And then the unique part of our buy down is we created this countywide home rule tax increment district where we allocate 33% of our growth and revenues to transportation. And so a portion of that gets used to subsidize or buy down these fees. And we calculate this yearly based on the actual permit. So we look at what was the fee that we should have charged based on their trip generation, what is the fee that we actually charge as a subsidized rate, and then we backfill or subsidize that differential every year based on the actual permits that are generated. This is just an example of how we do our 33% tax increment. Our base year for our tax increment, we started this in 2000, the bottom of the market basically, in 2011 or 12, and so that tax increment fund has been growing over time. I think it's up to 12 million right now. But every year it goes up because we set that base year at the bottom of the market. And then this is just an example of how we calculate the buy down. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we go district by district. We look at again, the fee that we should have charged, then the fee we actually charged, and that difference has to be bought down. And then we make sure, do we have enough other revenue sources to backfill or buy down each of those permits. So far, we've been in a subsidy situation. In other words, we don't have a deficit on buy down. We've done it right. We've generated enough from these other revenue sources to be able to achieve our buy down so far. But we balance, we look at that every 3 years to make sure we're still on track. So, you know, how do you make this legal? That's the tricky part because you get all these incentives. You know, one thing that we did is we looked into the Florida statutes, and I realize that not every state is going to have something like this, but in 2011, the state legislature in Florida adopted House Bill 7207, the Community Planning Act. One little known aspect of that act was that they adopted what's 163-3185F Florida statutes, where they specifically encourage developments that encouraged exempting or discounting the impacts of locally desired development, and they specifically mentioned urban areas, redevelopment, job creation, and mixed use. Well, these are all the things that we subsidize in Pasco County. So we have that legislative support in terms of these discounts or exemptions. Then, in 2013, I think some of the developers were a little scared about what is this mobility fee thing that Pasco is doing, and how does it comply with the law? And so they tried to adopt some legislation dealing specifically with mobility fees, and we had repealed transportation concurrency, and I could give a whole nother lecture on the interplay between transportation concurrency and mobility fees that I'm not going to do now. But they said that if a local government repeals transportation concurrency, it's encouraged to adopt an alternative mobility fee funding system that uses one or more of the tools and techniques identified in F. Now, F is this. It's these encouragement or discount. So at least in Florida, they're encouraging a mobility fee system that provides these exemptions or discounts. Can't say that's the case for every other state, but it helps to have that statutory authorization. However, and I'm going to skip over this, they did make it clear, though, that a mobility fee-based funding system has to comply with the dual rational nexus test for impact fees. So you still have to comply with the dual rational nexus test, and that's where things get tricky, because you're providing an exemption or discount, and you still have to comply with that test. And many of you know what that is in Florida, but I'm going to talk specifically about the needs prong of the dual rational nexus test, because that's the tricky part for mobility fees. You have to show that there's a nexus between the proposed development and the need for additional capital facilities. So the reason that is difficult for mobility fees is because, first of all, it's limited to capital facilities. So as you all know, impact fees can only fund capital. One of the issues you have with mobility, or mobility fee, and our mobility fee has a transit component, but it only assesses for the capital part of that transit. You still have the operation and maintenance portion of that transit that is the big part of transit costs. And so that's an issue, because you can't use that fee you charge the developer to pay for those operation and maintenance costs. The other issue you have on the needs prong is that if you're trying to promote or discount certain forms of development, that becomes a potential legal issue if you don't have a subsidy or buy down, because otherwise you have certain developments that are paying for a different need than other developments. They're paying for a level of service that they may never achieve if you do not backfill your capital plan or subsidize that impact for which you're not charging the incentivized development. So the way we dealt with the capital versus O&M issue is we used a different funding source for transit operations. And so this home rule tax increment district that we created, it's based on the case called Strand that allows counties in Florida to do home rule tax increment financing. I think we were probably the first county in the state to do this on a countywide basis. So we earmarked a portion of our tax increment revenues, that 33% increase in revenues, for transit operations. So we tried to create a holistic system. We didn't want to ignore the operation and maintenance component of our system, and so we earmarked a portion of our tax increment for transit operations. And then in terms of how we discounted, how we dealt with the needs prong of the dual rational nexus test, first of all, in terms of T&D, Mudroom, and TOD, there is a study in California that was done by Caltrans that shows that these forms of development do generate less vehicle miles traveled. So we were able to rely on that study to show that those studies, because they generate less trips, we can assess them less just for that reason alone. However, that didn't get us quite to the incentive that we wanted for those types of developments. So we had to use other techniques. We talked about the different levels of service, but ultimately we got there through the subsidy or buy down. So we got there partway on the TND and TOD and Mudroom based on the Caltrans study, but to get to the fees where we really wanted them to be in terms of an incentive to development, we had to use the subsidy or buy down for certain fees. And so this is an example of our fees. I'm going to show you the T&D, Mudroom, and TOD fees in a second. But on the left-hand column is our prior transportation impact fee. That was our old transportation impact fee prior to 2011 when we adopted mobility fees. On the right, you'll see our fees for the urban, suburban, and rural areas. You can tell single family, they get progressively higher as you move from urban, suburban to rural. Same thing with apartments. Same thing with retail. Now, in terms of light industrial and office and hotel, our board really wanted those uses in Pasco County. And just to give you an idea why, and I'm not saying every county is like this, but Pasco County has historically been a bedroom community to Hillsborough and Pinellas County, and so our board really wanted to encourage office, industrial, and hotel uses. And so they said, we're going to make a statement, they're going to be zero in Pasco County. So we heavily subsidize. The majority of our subsidy and buy-down funds go into those three uses. And I will say that in terms of effectiveness, that is the area where we've seen the most effectiveness. Our rate of hotel development has significantly increased since 2011. Same thing with office and light industrial. I cannot tell you that's completely attributable to our mobility fee, though. Okay, it could be because of other economic conditions, but the rate of growth has increased for those particular uses. I will also say in terms of the urban, suburban, and rural, that probably 90% of our growth is in the urban area, and I can't tell you again, that's solely because of our mobility fee, but that's what we're in fact seeing. My personal opinion is that the fee is helpful, and it's certainly from a marketing perspective helpful, but in my opinion, it sort of helps on the margins. You know, if what we've seen anecdotally is nobody's going to come in and build an office development in Pasco County solely because of our zero fee. However, what we discovered is that they might build a bigger building. In other words, they use that offset of the mobility fee to build more square footage of that office. The hotel, you know, if it's a hotel and they're deciding between, we were right on the border of Hillsborough County and they can locate on our side of the border or Hillsborough side of the border, it might be a factor there. So I can't tell you that it's the sole reason that we're getting some of this development, but I think it's helping on the margins. Same thing as it goes the case for TUD, TND, and Mudroom. So what you'll see from this is that the fees for TUD, TND, and Mudroom are lower than our standard fees that I showed you earlier. And those are sort of progressively more incentive, like TUD gets the best incentive, TND's slightly less, and then Mudroom slightly less. We're seeing in terms of the form-based incentives, the most success we're having is in the Mudroom category, again, because for whatever reason, TOD and TND are a bad word in Pasco. The problem we have with TOD, and many of you know this if you're familiar with the Tampa Bay area, we don't have a meaningful regional transit system in Tampa Bay, and so it's hard to really encourage TOD development without a meaningful regional transit system. We have local bus service, but that's really not enough to support TOD. But in terms of Mudroom type development, again, I think it's helping on the margins. You know, a development that might have normally built as a gated subdivision sees the incentive for mudroom development and is more likely to build a non-gated subdivision with interconnectivity, a complete bicycle pedestrian network, minimum density, mixed use. So that's where we're seeing the most success in terms of the form-based incentives. We do hope if Tampa ever gets to a true regional transit system, and hopefully we'll get there soon, we might start to see more of the TOD and T&E, but for now, our goal is to try to at least get Pasco to be transit ready, even if, so that when we finally get that regional transit, it's available. So this is just like an illustrative example of how the incentives could work. So this kind of compares, you get a movie theater, they build out in our rural area, they would be paying $21,454 per screen, which is actually more than our prior transportation impact fee used to be. If you build that same movie theater in a T&D form in a town center, it would be about half of what our prior transportation impact fees is. So in terms of the planning stage, we are starting to see more developments at least commit to this form of development. A lot of it has not come out of the ground yet, but we're seeing more commitments because they want that incentives in terms of the fee structure. Another example, we have these all throughout Florida, Publix. You build that in the rural area, and we do have, Publix still builds in our rural area. I'm not going to tell you they're not, and that's about what they look like. You know, their fee would be about 160% of our old transportation impact fee. That same supermarket in a T&D town center, we're getting our first one, I think, on State Road 54, probably in the next 2 or 3 years that will look more like this one. They would pay, obviously, a fraction of what they'd pay in the rural area. So we're hoping that that form-based incentive will start to resonate with the development community and that this fee differential will help them make this choice, because the market wants to build this, doesn't necessarily want to build this, but that differential in fees we're hoping can be a difference. Okay, so with that, let's turn it back over. We're going to do questions at the end, right? Or do you want to do questions now?
We can take a couple questions if you have them, or if not.
All right. Okay.
Just a quick question about the property tax, because you have the increment district and the sales. I guess sales tax wouldn't change, but I'm thinking about that Publix example.
Yes.
And do you see them doing kind of an evaluation of their property tax liability and how that compares to the change in the impact fee liability?
So
it would be worth more in that downtown, nicer configuration.
Right. So, well, yeah. I mean, so you're saying they're paying more property taxes.
Sorry, yeah, I guess they're not paying that differential.
Right.
So they're but are they going to be paying more for that site, and their property is costing them more to develop that downtown?
It is. There's no question that this is costing them more. So part of our reason for this incentive, and I will tell you that when we came up with these incentives amounts, they weren't totally arbitrary. We met with some of the developers that do this form of development and said, okay, what do we need to get our fees at so that we can level the playing field between these two forms of development? Where do we need to incentivize it so that it's worth you building this instead of this?
That's what I want.
And so we have intentionally set those fee levels at a level where we think it's enough of an encouragement for them to build this. The tax revenues doesn't work like that because we just collect it. Now a percentage of that goes into then subsidize this form. So we've used part of that tax collections to subsidize this form.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, your first part did. That's what I was
Okay.
just confusing myself.
Yes.
On your buy down, it looked on your little form chart there, you use gas tax first, then sales tax, and then if there's an additional buy down, you use that property tax. Is that how you?
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly how we do it. Because the reason for that is because we wanted to, our second local option gas tax in Florida has to be used for capital, and our sales tax has to be used for capital. So we wanted to make sure that the sources that were restricted to capital went to buy down first. The tax increment can be used for operation and maintenance, and we use that for transit operations. We actually use some of it for roadway maintenance too. So we wanted the source with the most flexibility to be used last, if that makes sense.
Other than the operation?
Actually, believe it or not, we've had enough subsidy from gas tax and sales tax that we haven't needed to dip into the tax increment for purposes of subsidy. Now, that being said, we still use some of it for our capital plan. Not because we have to, because for subsidy reasons, but if we needed to for subsidy reasons, it would have to be put into capital. If it is not needed for subsidy reasons, we could put it in either transit operation and maintenance, or roadway operation and maintenance, or capital. We've expanded our transit routes with that funding source, so it's going into transit operations. It goes into roadway maintenance, but some of it does get used for capital as well.
So you
Am I answering your question?
Yeah, but you did, but you're not really using it for general operations in general. You're using it to do some of these other things that
Well,
kind of align with this.
it has to be used on transportation. Okay, it's earmarked for transportation, so that includes transit operations, transit capital, roadway maintenance, bicycle pedestrian capital, bicycle pedestrian maintenance. So that 33% is earmarked for transportation. It cannot be used for anything else, if that makes
Yeah, that's
sense.
what I wanted to know.
But we haven't, in terms of, I think where you were going with your question is, have we had to use it for a legally required subsidy yet? And the answer is no. We've had enough gas tax and sales tax available to use for the legally required subsidy that we haven't had to do that yet. Now, I will tell you, we're about to go through an update this year. Our board loves our system so much, they want to have even more incentives. And now they want to, they want to incentivize infill lots in their redevelopment area. Because right now, in our redevelopment area, and most jurisdictions give you credit for prior use on redevelopment. You only get paid the difference. In our redevelopment area, we don't charge anything if you're redeveloping. So even if you're taking a small commercial building and you're building a bigger one with more trips, we subsidize that additional impact through our subsidies. We have one commissioner that wants to create that subsidy, use that subsidy not just for redevelopment lots, but also for infill lots. And so that's going to eat into our subsidy budget, and so we might have to start using some of that tax increment. But that's something we look at as every time we do an update. We have another commissioner that in our rural area wants to incentivize the landowners that restrict their lots to like 100 acres or greater. In other words, if they agree to preserve, right, if they preserve their land, that we would charge them a reduced fee for the one house they put on that land. It's sort of a rural preservation concept, and so we're looking at that to help preserve the rural areas. So the advantage of this mobility fee system is it allows you to interject these social or policy considerations into your fee structure and tailor those incentives to where you want to see them.
I was going to ask other way around, as the market gets stronger, if you are seeing more development happening more naturally, do you cut the subsidy?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question because that exact scenario came up in the case of office, okay? Because one flaw I see in our system is that we subsidize all office, whether it's the little condo office building or the large Class A office building. So we went to our board this year and said, hey, can we just stop subsidizing these little condo offices? Let's just subsidize the large Class A office because we think the condo office is going to come naturally. Our board didn't want to go there yet, but they said in the next update we'll do that. Okay, it's because they don't see us quite ready to give up the subsidy for all office. They like it from a marketing perspective. So, any more questions before I turn it over to Orlando? Okay, thank you.
So City of Orlando, a few years back, converted their roadway-based transportation impact fee to a multimodal transportation impact fee. And around the same time, they looked at providing incentives to target areas, targeted land uses. They had a technical advisory committee that met for like a period of 6 to 7 months, I think. And it included members from the business community, development, and as well as other civic organizations, and it really was a civic-minded group. It didn't lean toward any one specific interest. They were really trying to do what's best in the best interest of the community. So some of the things they looked at, should they give discounts by geographic area? The top part that says number 1 is the older part of the city that has the most space, most tax revenue, and also it's more dense and facilities are there. So they were saying that they really want to encourage development to come to that area because infrastructure is there is a tax base to pay for services. Then the second area is the airport area, and the third is the medical city, Lake Nona area. And in those areas, they weren't as willing to provide any discounts. They also looked at some of the land uses, like which land uses should get some priority, and really focused on mixed use and TOD type of development, primarily, again, because of their efficiency as well as the tax revenues. They did talk about industrial in the airport area, but nowhere else. So again, when they were doing that, this is the chart that you saw prior. But again, these were the type of analysis they were looking at and trying to pick the land uses that are most beneficial to the city. So out of that came several incentives. One is change of use. They did away with the charging the fee for change of use. One is the TND discount, and then another one is TOD. So change of use, they adopted in April 2011, and it's really geared towards small businesses. And their primary goal was to fill the vacant buildings. At the time, they had a lot of vacant buildings. So if you have a retail operation and you want to change it to a restaurant, say, typically you have to pay the differential. And when you intensify it, sometimes that fee can be substantial. So they waived all those change of use fees, especially, and really only for small businesses. And then recently, in 2014, they put a cap to $20,000 per application. From that, what they saw during the past 5 years, they saw about 92 applications, total fees waived about $2.2 million, so average incentive is about almost $24,000. And they tracked that this created about 1,100 jobs. So this is an example of, again, on the margin type development. So a lot of these were small mom and pop restaurants, and that impact fee made a difference. It wasn't. Then they have a Southeast Orlando sector plan where they are trying to encourage mixed use. So there they had a TND discount, about 30%. And over the past 5 years, they had two major developments there. And one was a combination of single-family, multifamily units of 150 single-family and 50 multifamily, and received a discount of about $206,000. And then the other one is a larger one that also has a commercial component, about $2.4 million. And these are the ones that they are keeping track. They give annual reports to their board, and they evaluate whether they need to continue on a yearly basis, if there's enough market, or whether they should put a cap and so on. Then their TOD discount was implemented in October 2012, and this is in the downtown core within a quarter mile of the transit, Sunrail or limo routes. And it gives you up to 50% discount. They have 4 criteria, so they look, each one is worth 12.5%, adding up to 50%. So they look at if you are providing more pedestrian facilities than is required. That's one. Same thing with bike facilities. That's the second one. A third one is if they are providing more than 50% of their tenants subsidy for transit. And then the final one is they require that the first floor of the building, more than 50% of it be open commercial area, not like a gym for the building, but it's a commercial use open to public. So those all add up to the 50% discount. So again, over the past 5 years, they had about 12 approved, and the total fees waived is $6.5 million. Average incentive was over 500, so it's pretty substantial. But then the new construction investment was about $450 million. So we then recently worked on a study where we were looking at the incentives for impact fee incentives, specifically for affordable and workforce housing. So that, of course, is becoming a growing concern, especially on the coastal communities that are more urbanized as the housing prices get increased, housing for not just lower income, but as well as the teachers, just the workforce housing is becoming a concern. So in Collier County, ULI did a study, and they suggested they do a master plan. As part of that, impact fees was evaluated and to see what other communities are doing, what kind of results they are getting, and so on. So you can see this chart is showing the increase in housing prices between 2000 and 2016. And the largest increase is the orange dots, like that's about 40% to up, all the way to 180% almost. And you see, again, that's all the West Coast and some other areas. And when you focus on Florida, again, these are all the coastal counties that are the ones that are really seeing that kind of increase. And that's where we're starting to have more discussions about policies to address affordable workforce housing. So quick definitions. By affordable is typically for very low and low income, and that's measured up to 80% of median household income, depending on the category. And then the workforce housing is 80 to 100% median household income. So we looked at about 30 communities, narrowed it down to 10 to kind of see what they are doing. So these communities implemented impact fees in 1 to 9 service areas. And about 80% of them waived all their fees, some of them selectively. There are 2 communities, they actually did it by geographic area, so they try to focus on CRAs or other blighted areas. And discounts range anywhere from only 10% to 100%, depending on income level and the location. So in terms of the fees, that resulted up to $16,000 increase versus for single family. So one thing to keep in mind is if you are doing any impact fee discounts, schools and transportation are the major ones. You know, when we look at the infrastructure value in a community, really schools and transportation make up about 70 to 85% of it, followed typically by parks. And then the fees reflect that. Fees tend to be the highest in those. So for example, one jurisdiction we looked at, they only had a parks impact fee, and really they said they didn't get any interest from anyone. So it was only a $2,000 fee, so it's kind of like you're waiving it. It's not a huge differentiator. Okay, so then as far as funding, how they fund these discounts, they use their SHIP funds. Some use interest on impact fees, what interest they earned, and then some just take the loss. They don't really, maybe they document as de minimis. And then the ones that do track the status, they require typically 10 to 30-year compliance. They either put a deed on the property if it's owner-occupied. If it's a rental-occupied, they require annual reports where it kind of shows the income level of the renters. And they all utilize other programs as well. We didn't find anyone that has only the impact fee incentive. So that kind of makes it hard to draw conclusions how much of its own impact. But the other incentives that use, like these are some of the examples. It's not even a comprehensive list. But we did hear over and over again that density bonuses being very popular, and being able to use that even to require part of it being affordable housing. So when we look at our results, again, this is as much as the communities can provide. It's an average per year, but again, the time periods are not the same. So if somebody is including a time period that during downturn when nothing is being built, average. So it's not as scientific as we wanted to have it, but it kind of gives you a sense. So average dollar amount maybe per year about 160,000. Now number of units developed, the average is 100 and the range is nothing to 300. The ones on the high end, we have 200, 300. Those jurisdictions also had inclusionary zoning or linkage fees. So it's hard to say if those programs were part of, affecting that. And then when you drop them, the high end end up being about only 80 units. And again, this was a time period of, depending on what they were able to give us, 2 to 18 years. So along those lines, we did run into some relatively unique programs for Florida. Some of these are pretty common in California and West Coast, but the linkage fees, there are a couple jurisdictions, there's several jurisdictions charging for it, and they can be for residential or non-residential development. So while we were studying what kind of impact fee discounts you give to encourage workforce affordable housing, some people say, well, we actually require another impact fee to get to that. And then they give waivers for certain targeted industries out of that impact fee. So it was kind of an interesting circle. And then the inclusionary zoning, it does require that a portion of the units be affordable workforce housing level. And we have like Palm Beach County, Jupiter, Broward County have those kind of policies. And then they also have at times in lieu fee. If you don't want to build the units, you can pay in lieu fee. So those fees range anywhere from $50,000 to $200,000 per eligible unit. So if they want only 10% of the units to be affordable housing, if it's a 100-home development, the fee per home becomes $5,000 or $20,000 to $20,000, if that makes sense. And then Palm Beach County, they implemented in 2004. They feel like they had 1,300 units that they tracked, developed, and they're expecting more rental and some townhouses, and that's the part that they really want owner-occupied. They collected about $4 million in terms of in lieu fees that they will use for purchase assistance and buying down the other fees or other incentives. And linkage fees, Winter Park had them all the way in early 1990s at kind of both for residential and non-residential, but then their most recent council did away with them. For now, they don't have it. During the peak development, they said it did generate about $350,000 and had about 70 units developed. So again, is being in the, like whatever is in the fund balance, 500 is going to be used to any kind of incentives for more housing. And then Town of Jupiter, they have a combination. They have a linkage fee for non-residential development and then inclusionary zoning with the in lieu fee for residential. So since implementation, they collected about $300,000, and they do have a waiver for the medical biochemistry type industries. So again, just to kind of wrap up, some of the final thoughts again is really to keep in mind what the goals are of the community and then target the incentives to that. And then it's helpful, obviously, to track what's happening in the market in relation to your incentives and combining. Again, we did not find a jurisdiction that had only one type of incentive. So to the extent that you can combine and create a package, they tend to be more successful. And we found that they are most successful, again, with the development at margin. So if it's a starter home that has not much to cut, because if it's a luxury home and the impact fee is high, they can probably change the kitchen countertops or somehow they can make it up. But if it's a basic starter home or affordable housing type thing, there's not much to cut, and that's when they seem to make a difference. Dave gave some examples where he saw some margin things, and then again, in Orlando's experience, they specifically mentioned small mom and pop restaurants with the change of use and some of their TODs. With that, we'll be happy to answer any questions. And also, if you are doing anything, tell us too. Yeah.
So on the affordable housing one, aren't there studies that show that affordable housing below a certain size unit actually generates less trips?
Yes.
So, I mean,
Yes, actually,
on that, so
that's right. So we are able to tier the housing to begin with. 15, like small homes tend to generate fewer trips. In addition, small homes with the low income also generates even fewer trips, and that's kind of they don't have as many cars and per household and so on. So that helps for moderate the fee. It also helps the government when they are buying down. They can buy down more units with the same SHIP funding and so on. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, I can add one more thing that we
Sure.
did. It's on. I guess I go up there.
It should have been.
In Pasco, we also, I didn't put this in my PowerPoint, we also have something called the government acquisition credit. And so whenever we condemn property or FDOT condemns property and they demolish a building, well, let me back up. When a private developer demolishes a building, they get that credit. They get a credit for their prior use. So in Pasco, we created a program where anytime we, as the county or the Water Management District or DOT, go in and condemn a property, whether it's for floodplain or to build a road or to build some other infrastructure, if they remove that building, we take that credit back. We basically, the credit for that removing that structure from the system, we take that credit back and the government then owns that credit. And then we can use that to pay for the impact for affordable housing, for economic development. And so it's another something else you may want to explore if you're doing a lot of condemnation, if you're doing a lot of government acquisitions of structures. Remember, if you're demolishing that structure, you removed it from your system. So somebody should be able to take advantage of that credit. And so why not the government? And so we also use that as well. Right, that's how I was going to answer his question is, I don't think the impact fee alone is going to stop somebody from building. Okay, but it could, on the margins, affect where you build, the form of your development, and so that's why we do what we're doing. I don't think, now the one exception to that, at least in our experience, might be hotel and office, because residential retail seems to go wherever, you know, they just always build wherever there's a demand. Sometimes in the case of office and hotel, they can build in multiple locations. And so to a certain extent, local governments compete for that type of development. And so there you might see the fee be a part of the competition. So let me just comment on that, because before we did our mobility fee system, we got a lot of pressure from the development community to just do an across-the-board reduction, similar to what you mentioned. And we ultimately ended up not going that direction because, in our opinion, there are some uses that it doesn't matter what the fee is, they're going to build. An example is single-family residential. We have found no correlation whatsoever between single-family residential and our fee. We could charge 5 times what we're charging on single-family residential, and it might increase the price of the house, but it's still going to build. And so my personal opinion is I don't like across-the-board reductions because it treats all uses equally. And I don't think all of them have the same economics, and I don't think all of them are as affected by that marginal reduction as much as others. So, and I use single family as the best example of one that I don't think is affected at all, in my opinion.
That's why next year when we re-implement this, we're looking at commercial only, because you're right, single family.
And the other thing to make it a little bit more complicated is, you know, anytime we do studies, people want to see what their neighbors are charging, but it's only one fee at a time, whereas there's other fees. So if you are really trying to do a competitive analysis, it needs to be everything they have to pay, not just one isolated fee here and, you know.
I noticed on your slides where you did the overview of the state of Florida, that it talked about the fee being suspended or moratorium. But did you account for in that slide, because you were comparing average annual to population growth, those that reduced it but didn't eliminate it?
No, this one, it was just the ones that either had it or went to 100% moratorium. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's not, I mean, like, we recognize it's not perfectly scientific. It just, we didn't find, like you would expect if it was that effective, that middle group would have experienced at least as much as the ones that have the fee, even if they reduced. But we didn't find that. So we feel like maybe they were the ones that were suffering the most in terms of lack of development economically, and they felt like they should cut the fee. So we don't, it's like, you know, which one is the driving factor?
The other thing you got to be careful with when you just cut your fees like that is, are you devaluing a developer's impact fee credits? Because when we encountered this issue, we had some people pushing, we had some of the builders pushing for a moratorium on fees. We had some of the master developers saying, don't do that, because now I can't sell my credits. So you got to be careful when you're just across the board reductions, because what are you doing to your developer credits? Any more questions or examples?
Or anyone want to share their success or failure?
So I guess to sum up, I think we both agree that incentives can be useful for certain forms or certain uses or on the margins. I don't think it's going to be, even with our zero fee for office, I don't think you can say we're going to just get tons of square foots of office just because we happen to have that incentive. But I think it helps on the margins, and some of it's good from a policy perspective and a growth management perspective as well. So.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Did you say you're, like, when you eliminate change in use, did that have the biggest impact? Because you said your goal was to fill the vacant
That was the Orlando's case, and that was the city of Orlando. They felt that it made a difference, and they felt that they specifically talked about mom and pop restaurants because restaurant fee tends to be high, and so if you can take a retail place and not have to pay that fee during the recession. Now they are monitoring and they put a cap on it in 2014. I think that's because they are kind of feeling like economy is rebounding. They don't need to give as much incentives maybe, so.
But the one common thing, and he mentioned it was really good, they set up an account for Marshall carried out for the government, and then a revenue account to buy out, which I think is very legal. What Orlando said, and they didn't do it and measure this, they had quite a few developments that went from more intense to lease. And they measured that, the more to lease, it would probably exceed the lease to more. And now they didn't set the system like he did because he had the government, but it made sense, like, go ahead and come after me, I got more transitions downward than do forward, and I got this specific area with redevelopment and vacant lots, you know, and so they did it and it worked. So it's kind of an interesting thing to at least come up with a good reason why you can do that and not legally get in trouble. And Orlando kind of did the same process with it, and they had some real success with some of the redevelopment.
Well, that sounds similar to what we did with our government acquisition credits, where we're taking something off the system, we're moving that impact, and so we're going to reallocate that to some other use.
It's a very creative way of having tools to do some of these incentives without getting yourself in trouble.
Well, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all.